Hello again to Need to Know Introduction to British Cultural Studies. This is video number 3, and today we're going to talk about social class, or how Bourdieu explains why red wine is intellectual. Today we're talking about Pierre Bourdieu, who is a French sociologist, and his main work for us was that in the 1960s and 70s he conducted an empirical study of French society. He looked into social milieus and their reproduction, and enabled critique of structural inequality in, for example, education institutions. His theories, however, need careful consideration of changes. So he conducted a study in the French society of the 1960s, and of course, today's society is different in many respects. And he also turned a rather blind eye on intersectionality, so how gender, race, or ethnicity, and also class intersect and create unique patterns of identity. Let us first contrast Marxism and Bourdieu's thoughts. Social organization in both conceptualizations is a question of capital. If you remember from Marxism, capital for Marxism is resources for production or economy, so money, raw material, or who owns the factories. Now, for Bourdieu, capital can have different forms. He says that capital are the resources in economical terms. This is just like Marxism, but he also says that capital can be social and cultural. And you can have actual capital, which means you have the money, or you can have symbolic capital, which means you have certain possessions which indicate that you have money. So, for example, a person owns a castle or a very big flat, and people think this person has really a lot of money, but actually this person is in a financial crisis. But because of what this person has and embodies, people think this person has capital. So this would be symbolic capital. Every person in society has a portfolio of capital. That means certain economical, social, and cultural resources they can use in everyday life. And capital is directly related to social class, or the milieu you come from. This is why capital is so important for Bourdieu. Let's take a look at the different forms of capital that Bourdieu defines. On this slide, we have different pictures which signify forms of capital. Let us first have a look at the bookshelf. Here we see a lot of books, and they're usually old books, but that doesn't matter so much. Books signify knowledge. If you can read and if you own books, this signifies that you know something, that you're an educated person. So it would go into the direction of knowledge and education and be cultural capital. Here we only have the books, and the books as objects signify this. So the books would be objectified cultural capital. In the next picture, we can see a boy playing the violin. And what does he? He plays the violin. So this would also be related to knowledge or skills, but it is something this person actually does. So it would be some form of embodied or embodified cultural capital because it is something that you can do with your brain or your body. Then we have the young woman wearing the hat. This is a very common sight in the UK or the US when people get their university degrees. And this means that this person has some form of institutionalized cultural capital. She has a university degree from maybe a very prestigious university even, and this signifies that this person has knowledge. It is less of an object, but rather an institutionalized form, so related to a certain university and related to a certain degree you have. And then we have the two other pictures, the one where we have a party with people. So you don't only have cultural capital in terms of knowledge, but also so-called social capital. And this means that you know certain people and you can basically use them in your everyday life. Using them sounds a bit awkward, but it means that you know people and this helps you to get on with your living. And then we have economic capital. I just signified it by money. Now, let us summarize this in one slide. We have economic capital, which means money and sources for production, just as in Marxism. We have social capital, people you know in society, people, contacts which can help you in everyday life. We have cultural capital, and cultural capital can either be objects or possessions, which signify knowledge, skills you can do with your brain or your body, or institution degrees. And then there is this kind of symbolic capital. So this means that you may or may not have economic, social, and cultural capital, but people think you have that. People see you having a certain social status, and thus you have symbolic capital. Since we looked into cultural capital a little bit more, let's also summarize this. First, we had objectified cultural capital. This would be books or maybe also computer nowadays, everything that is an object that symbolizes that the owner has knowledge, has cultural capital. Next, we had embodified cultural capital, so some kind of skill. A person who has this kind of capital, for example, can read, can write, can speak very well in public, can play an instrument, every skill or what people can do with their body or their brain. And then we have institutionalized capital. This would be degrees and affiliations. And we also have to think about different kinds of schools and different schools which have, or universities which are very prestigious. So for example, a degree from Oxford University would just be a very big thing for someone because Oxford is just a very, very famous university. Or having visited a certain private school is much more valued in society than having been to your local high school and maybe made your A-levels there. So this would be institutionalized cultural capital, something that is concerned with a certain kind of education and a certain university or school. Bourdieu used his forms of capital to create the so-called social space. And what you can see here is a very simplified version of that. The social space is no actual social space or so, but a graph. And we here have the cultural capital as the horizontal axis and the economic capital as vertical axis. And in order to cluster people according to their capital, Bourdieu used taste. Taste in the sense of what leisure time activities do people have, what is their job, what foods do they consume, where is their home, what is their surrounding, which events and festivities do they visit. So what taste do people have in everyday life as markers of capital? I symbolized this by the little black pictograms. So for example, wine would signify high cultural and economic capital because it's expensive and it's also associated with knowledge and intelligent people. So this is why red wine would be seen as something intelligent and intellectual people consume. Also, theater has high cultural capital. It's not that expensive depending on the theater, but it's seen as something that is valued as cultural capital. Whereas, for example, beer on the other side of the spectrum would be seen as something that is seen as working class, that is seen as less cultural capital, and thus it would belong at the spectrum to people where they have low cultural capital. Also, the kind of job people have. A person with high cultural capital would work in a bureau maybe, or more likely at university, at school, or in some kind of higher institution, whereas a person with low cultural capital would work in in some kind of crafts job. So for example, as a car mechanic or as a miner. That is a very, very rigid distinction, and of course it's not as black and white as this, but just to clarify this. And now what I did is I sorted three people into this social space. So person one has high cultural and social, not social, but economic capital. This person is likely to drink wine, go to the theater, live in a very beautiful either villa, house, or something, most likely also near the city or in the city, and then has a lot of books, maybe has a very nice laptop, and just leads a life that signifies I have money and I have knowledge. Person number two, for example, would have a lot of cultural capital, but not so much money. This could be a student in a higher education institution, so at university, a person that is intelligent and works on their knowledge, but doesn't have money, but still is seen as having much cultural capital. Person number three would now be a completely different person. A person probably from either working class background or middle class where the person maybe works as a car mechanic, so has maybe a lot of money, but doesn't use this money to go to the theater, but maybe to live somewhere nice in the countryside, buy an old car, visit races, for example, so car races, not horse races, that would be associated with upper class, maybe drinks beer. So what this person likes signifies where this person comes from. And this is basically what Bourdieu thought about this social space. Now, if you conduct a study like Bourdieu, then you don't only have 3 people in the social space, but hundreds. And this means that people cluster in social space, that they are in one place. So, for example, you have 100 people there, and maybe 25 people are more or less in the same space, in the social space. And these people now can be twofold. Either they belong to a real class, or as Marxism calls it, a class for itself. This means that they're aware of their shared tastes, behavior, and living circumstances. Maybe they even know each other, but they would say, I position there with these people, and yes, I am part of, for example, the upper class. They believe that they are part of this social group or class, and they also actively show that they are members of this class and distance themselves from others. So they would, for example, meet in some club at a weekly basis or go to the same festivities, and they would actively share what they do. So they would have grand dinners together, but they would maybe not go to a car race or not go to Oktoberfest, because they would say, no, this is not what our class does. We distance us from the others. People who are clustered in social space can, however, also belong to a theoretical class, or as Marxism calls it, a class in itself. This would mean that people don't have this shared sense of taste, circumstances, behaviors. They don't see themselves as part of a group, and they do not actively represent that they belong to the same class. This would, for example, be the case if you think about immigrants from different nations. They would have more or less the same difficulties, the same experiences, but because they consider themselves as very different from each other, they wouldn't say we belong to the same group of people. Also, that is a very Marxist assumption now. People who are working class do not necessarily see themselves as working class, and especially not as belonging to the same trade. So, for example, the car mechanic would not say that he is the same as the carpenter, or would not say that he is the same as the painter. So, different job affiliations would coincide with not seeing themselves as the same social group. So this would be either real classes or theoretical classes, according to Bourdieu. People who are clustered in social space or come from the same class have a certain form of shared habitus. As Nick Crossley puts it, quote, they are inclined to develop similar lifestyles, outlooks, dispositions, and a tacit sense of their place in the world, or class unconsciousness, that is, class habitus, unquote. What does this mean? So, similar lifestyles, people live in the same way. They maybe have the same values and rituals, maybe they live in similar flats, they maybe have more or less similar furniture and consume similar dishes. They look the same, so they share some trends or something that is seen as normal in a certain social class. Dispositions, so who they are, how they look at the world, and also a tacit sense of their place in the world. So if people see themselves as working class, then that would go along with a certain feeling of, I belong there in the world. I belong into my social group. I belong into the pub and rather not into the fancy restaurant where the upper class goes. And it also seen as class unconsciousness because these embodied patterns of taste or behavior or manners of speaking as well, so dialect would be an example of habitus, they are not something that one actively does in everyday life. That is something that one learns over time and takes as normalcy. So a person from a certain background speaks in a certain way, behaves in a certain way, makes gestures in a certain way, has a certain taste, likes certain foods, activities, everything we discussed before, and doesn't like others. And this is not something that is consciously done, but something that is embodied and unconsciously repeated repeated throughout the whole life. Thus is why Crossley says this is a class unconsciousness. Examples would be, as I said, dialects. For example, if you think about received pronunciation, what is also called the Queen's, or I think nowadays we would call it the King's English, how people move in space. So if someone, for example, grew up in an environment where one has to be very aware of other people because other people just don't care about someone and will bump into you in the street, or maybe if you do something they don't like, just beat you up, then people develop a very distinct way of moving in space, always aware, always alert, which is completely different if you think, well, nothing can happen to me anyway. Also, the choice of clothing depends on where you grew up, what you think is appropriate or normal, and also where does one feel comfortable. I brought you two example pictures where we can have a look at habitus in society. These are from the film Titanic from 1997, and of course, this is not what life looks like nowadays. It's set in 1912. And what we can see here are two very, very distinct social classes or social groups in their very surrounding. And it is, I think, very clear where the upper class and where the working class is. We have an Irish working class party in third class and a dinner party, which is the upper class and first class. And you can see that people wear certain things, that people sit at the table or don't sit at the table in a certain way. And I mean, both are more or less festive aspects of life. But whereas in working class, this looks very, in a way, shabby, though. People can't dress up very, very fancy. And people have a certain kind of music they listen to and a certain style of dancing. People are also laughing very loudly, it seems. Whereas in working class, in an upper class, everything seems decent and very taken aback. Also, you have the white tablecloth, you have so many fancy glasses there. People are dressed up, and people also they sit very stiff and they don't laugh out loud. So you have a certain behavior and also manner of speaking that is associated with a certain social surrounding, which you can see from these pictures very well. So how habitus basically feeds into how people position themselves in social in life, and then also live according to that. What is also important about habitus is that certain forms of habitus are more valued than others and also very distinct from each other. And what happens is that the dominant social class places their habitus as civilized, desirable, and also uses it to distinguish themselves from lower class. So we do something different than them and thus we are better. The lower classes now, in Bourdieu's eyes, try to adapt to this habitus. And so you have dominant or hegemonic patterns of behavior and taste in society which are valued. What would be a very schoolyard example would be someone in the class saying, "What, you don't know this film, TikTok, band, brand, singer, whatever, so you don't know this? Where are you from?" So saying, okay, but everybody needs to know this. It is seen as normal in this social group to know something. This is the mainstream, this is what should be, and suddenly someone doesn't. And so this person is seen as the odd one out, the one not belonging to that social group because they probably grew up differently. Maybe they don't have a television or this child doesn't have a mobile phone yet. So based on what one knows and what the taste is, people are sorted and basically excluded or included in social groups. And habitus also is reproduced in social surroundings. So what a family is like predetermines what the childs are like or children are like. So if they eat some dishes, then the children will eat them and think this is normal. If they sing certain songs, this is what the children adapt to. And several forms of habitus, which is reproduced through the family, for example, agree with those dominant or hegemonic forms and are valued more than others. And this kind of reproduction now causes problems. You have educational injustice and epistemic injustice. Educational injustice would mean that a child from in German you would say bildungsnaher Hintergrund, so a child that has a family where everybody is highly educated, maybe even went to university, where they have loads of books at home, where reading is just something very common and people are just engaging into practices that are seen as reminiscent of cultural capital all the time, this child will have many advantages at school, whereas a child that used to just run around in his childhood or in their childhood and never see a book because there were just no books at home or few books, this child has a disadvantage at school because this child needs to learn everything the other child just got from home in the first place to be at the same level. So you have injustice because of where people came from and the habitus they adapted. Also epistemic injustice. The word of a professor, if it stands against the word of some illegal immigrant, will always be valued more, just because this person has a certain standing in society. Even though the immigrant may be right about a certain issue the professor doesn't know anything about, but still you have different valorization of the voice of people, of what they know because of their social status and habitus. Let's now have a look at very contemporary examples of dominant habitus or hegemonic habitus. Here we have a chart of the evolution of music genre popularity in the US. I'm sorry that this is not a UK example, but still, I think this highlights very much that at certain points in time, certain kinds of music were very popular, which nowadays aren't, and that in order to be valued in society, in a certain social group, you would have to follow the trend. And also social media trends. Do you know this? Do you know that? What is just the trend at the moment? What should be done? And so you have top films, fashion trends. You have the mainstream, which is at a certain point in time the dominant pattern in society. What people think you should wear, you should know, you should watch, and what basically categorizes people as belonging to a certain cool in group, whereas people who don't are just out of that group. And this also relates to what is valued at school. This is basically what I just explained before, which children or adults are advantaged or disadvantaged in society, also with regard to jobs. If you speak German or English with an accent, I think in Germany this is worse than in the UK, but if you speak German with an accent and the other person applying for a job does not, then it is very likely that the person who does not speak with an accent is the person who gets the job, because accents are usually, at least some kinds of accent, are associated with stereotypes. And what is not Bourdieu, but maybe also important here, is white privilege. People with a white skin color as privilege in society because whiteness is seen as normal. And also, if you look at the disability studies in critical psychology, people who have a certain mental disposition or physical disability, people like that are in a way disadvantaged in society, and what they think and say and do is valued less, or in some cases also more, than people who are seen as normal. So the idea of normalcy is actually not something normal and fair, but something very excluding. Now, this was a lot of theory, but I hope you understood it well. I thank you for listening, and before I see you next time, I want to draw your attention to one of the sources I put here. It's the first one, and if you look closely, this is a German source. So, of course, I didn't really include it because it's German, but I think that this explains the key theories by Bourdieu very well. So, if you feel like there is something that I didn't understand, you can, of course, post a comment and ask me about it. But you can also take a look at that, because maybe it helps if you're not so far into your studies of English yet to just read it in German. Apart from that, I wish you a pleasant time until I see you next time, and yeah, hope you liked the video.